I have been asked to, in addition to being a panelist on this, to moderate our session today, so I am very happy to do so. We'll try to keep our presentations tight time-wise, so we've got a little bit more time for some Q&A at the end. So I will just introduce everybody now, and then we'll go in the order that we're in the program. So joining me at the table is Ian Gavigan, a doctoral candidate in the Department of History at Rutgers, New Brunswick. He's a historian of labor, politics, and social movements in the modern U.S. and was involved in the 2023 labor strike. Jeremy Gower, a lecturer and member of UC AFT here at UC Santa Cruz, and Janina Lorenas, a voluntary member without a contract of UPT CWA 9119, serving on the local board as a member at large and works as staff here at UCSC. So we've got the Rutgers and UCSC comparison kind of happening here as sort of, I think, part of the logic of this panel. So to kick us off, we've got Ian.
All right. And how much time do I have again?
15 minutes.
15 minutes, great. I'll try to go short. Hi, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I remember we were told to speak right into the mic, so I'm going to try to do that. My name's Ian Gavigan. I'm an executive counselor and legislative chair of Rutgers AAUP-AFT, Local 6323. That's the union that represents full-time faculty, medical faculty, graduate student workers, librarians, postdocs, and EOF counselors across the 3 campuses of the Rutgers University system in New Brunswick, Camden, and Newark. I bring fraternal greetings from our union, as well as from our sibling locals, the Rutgers Adjunct Faculty Union and the AUP BHSNJ, which remains a separate local of medical faculty, but bargains in one contract with us, and we together form the Council of AUP chapters in the State University of New Jersey. I think it's important to start my remarks by talking about what Rutgers is as an institution and how it fits into the state of New Jersey and the kind of political economy of the Mid-Atlantic, and to then talk about, and thank you to Sarah for helping let me know what would be helpful or interesting to talk about. I'm going to talk about the kind of briefly the history of the unionization of Rutgers, the kind of uneven and interesting patterns that we've got there, how our coalition of Rutgers unions came into being, how during the pandemic our collaboration and commitment to wall-to-wall strategy intensified, and then I'll talk about our strike as well, and I'm sure that there will be some interesting opportunities in the Q&A and beyond to talk about some comparisons of our strike to others, but also just some how we can think through the differences of our various strikes towards effective strategy. So Rutgers is like the UC, although not nearly as large as UC, is a major research institution that has a statewide footprint. We like to say it has about 100,000 community members, and so that includes undergraduate students, graduate students, and graduate student workers, undergraduate student workers, campus workers of all variety, including faculty, including staff, and all the many job categories. There are about 30,000 workers at Rutgers, of whom about 20,000 are represented by a union, and all of those unions operate under public sector bargaining law in the state of New Jersey, treated as public sector workers, not as state workers. And about a little under half of those union represented workers, about 9,000 were represented in the recent contract negotiation process, which was across 3 locals and 2 units. And I can explain more about the units thing if folks are interested in that question. Rutgers is also, and I think this is a critical point, and increasingly so, intensifying every year, Rutgers is also a hospital network that has come to incorporate a kind of network of hospitals, especially throughout central and northern New Jersey, in a variety of public-private partnerships that bring existing medical facilities under the purview of the university, or kind of in its under its nonprofit protections, but operate with varying degrees of autonomy and flexibility. other major unions on our campus include the Union of Rutgers Administrators, which is the second largest union, which is the largest union outside of the group that bargained together, and that's and they always like to remind us never to use the word administration or administrators when talking about the bosses, because they're the administrators and they're not the bosses. But there are non-management administrators who do, a wide range of work. We have AFSCME locals on our campuses. They tend to be much more staff-driven, and they tend to also be the ones that organize or represent and bargain on behalf of the most precarious workers in our university, who do various kinds of blue-collar work on campus, and also blue and pink-collar work, including groundskeeping, dining staff, and other people who do the kind of the reproductive labor of the university outside of the classroom. There is a cops union, there are Teamsters locals, but most of these unions incorporate very, very few workers in comparison to the core AFT and AAUP and AFT locals. There is a relatively long history at Rutgers of unions talking to one another, but there's not a very long history of unions working with one another, and there's definitely no history of unions striking together at Rutgers before this contract cycle. And I think that it's a really important question to ask, well, how did we get to this point? And I would argue that, and I think many would back me up in our union, that the critical turning point was coming off of our 2019, the culmination of our 2019 contract campaign, when there was deep disappointment between coming from our adjuncts, who at the time were called part-time lecturers. After this contract, they no longer are. They're now called adjunct faculty, feeling that they had been essentially sacrificed for the full-time unit. We were then not jointly bargaining, but bargaining in close collaboration, and we came off of that attempt at collaboration, that attempt of amalgamation of a certain kind, with a lot of kind of bad feelings. But there was a strong commitment to turning those bad feelings into organizing and into kind of doing it better the next time around. And then the pandemic happened, and this is where that intention had to become a kind of reality, because what we saw very early on in the pandemic was the Rutgers administration go towards harsh austerity, which happened, of course, at many institutions, I'm sure in the UC and many of the institutions represented here, and mostly, and much more so for the kind of institutions that tend not to be represented in these spaces, which are unorganized community colleges and other kinds of very low-resourced, precarious institutions. At Rutgers, however, with high union density and leadership in some of the unions with a kind of more expansive vision, not just of what organizing on our campuses could be, but also interested in the revival of a fighting labor movement and the revival of an industrially oriented labor movement at broader scales, worked very hard early on in the pandemic to confront the austerity of the institutions. So we saw early on in the first 6 months of the pandemic the announcement that the university intended to lay off more than 1,000 Rutgers employees, most of whom were staff employees, so most of them non-instructional staff. Adjuncts also came under intensive threat, with a double-digit percentage of our adjunct faculty threatened with layoff. And the full-time unit, which again includes grads, I know that's unusual, and that's why I'm here today, also had a lot of like labor scholars on it, labor studies people, and so we have an interesting combination of kind of technical expertise and kind of political commitments, and we were able to devise a state-backed partial furlough program called a work share program, modeled on a kind of Northern European technocratic idea that the state will offer an unemployment benefit backstop for a partial furlough for workers to basically save the jobs of other workers. And so what we were able to do was negotiate with the management, with the boss, and with the state labor department to give access to unemployment benefits for exclusively for full-time faculty, so grads were excluded from this, to take a partial furlough, a temporary partial furlough, for the vast majority of them who made up to like under $200-something thousand, all of that was made up by the state, and for a very, very small number of people who made above 200, whatever that cutoff was, they didn't necessarily make all of it back from the state. And so for taking this, and there were administrative barriers, and it was a hard thing to do, but basically for making this kind of sacrifice to save the jobs for about 1,000 administrative staff and many adjuncts, I don't know the exact number of adjuncts, we were able to build a new sense of trust and solidarity on our campuses. And I think that was a powerful process that people looked at and said, oh, people are actually willing to take some risks. And again, the state was helping backstop these risks, but nonetheless, it was a risky thing to do. We bet on solidarity, and I think solidarity won. And so not only did we get a protection for layoffs from about 1,000 workers, but we also got a graduate extension for PhD candidates whose research was impacted by the pandemic. So hundreds of graduate students were able to access an additional year of funding as a result of this work-share program. So we had internal solidarities that we were building in our unit and solidarities across units as well. So coming out of, obviously we're still in the pandemic, but like coming out of that phase of the pandemic, we came into our contract campaigns. And I'll also note that we've worked very hard over the years to align contracts that are on our campuses. And so many, if not all, I think the vast majority of contracts expired at the same time, which was at the end of June of last year. And so we knew that we were coming into this cycle of contract fighting together. And so we entered into a formal agreement. Well, first I'll say we first merged our medical faculty unit into our full-time faculty unit, the full-time/grad unit, so that we would be bargaining formally the same contract. But under the arcane laws of New Jersey public sector bargaining, we were not able to formally do the same with our adjunct faculty unit. We would have to have waited another year, and that wasn't possible given the timeline of the contract. But we nonetheless entered into a formal agreement to do contract organizing together with the adjunct faculty unit, with the medical faculty. We were not able to bring any other, we did not successfully convince any of the other major unions that were up for bargaining at the same time with us to combine our organizing committees. And so that's why the specific constellation of unions representing 9,000 workers that went out together and bargained together came into being as it did. I'll also say that one of the important things that happened during the kind of intensive phase of the pandemic, the Zoom-only phase, I'll say, for the purposes of our union, I know many workers did not have the benefit of doing their job over Zoom, was we did a pretty intensive process of political education with members, and obviously not everyone participated, but the focus there was repeatedly and intensively about the issues of adjunctification, casualization, outsourcing, gigification, job security, graduate workers, et cetera, you get the sense. And we had pretty high participation, especially from several layers of leaders, underneath the kind of elected representatives, DART reps, et cetera. And we did a lot of work to shape our union's voice and our narrative and our organizing conversations around this idea that we need to raise the most vulnerable through the work that we're doing. And so I think that those are some of the, and so I'll also say, there's a lot of differences. There's uneven development ideologically, conceptually, among academic workers as in all workforces. All workforces are mixed. But there are a lot of ideas about who tenure-track faculty are. They hold the most leverage in an institution, in most institutions where tenure still remains. But they also, are pretty far away from, or see themselves to be pretty far away from the rest. I think that we did a lot of work to change how tenure stream people related to other workers on our campuses. And I'd be happy to talk more about that because I think it's important to remember that people can change and people are organizable. I haven't talked at all about our strike or our contract that we came out with, and I'm running out of time. So I'll just say that in 5 days, I've got 2 minutes, I'll try to fit this into 2 minutes. And I definitely want to talk about the role of the state in all of this because it matters so much. I'll just say the governor of our state took over our negotiations process. We didn't ask him to come. He called us up the night we took our vote to start the strike, which was Easter Sunday. Well, we can talk about timing too. He took over our negotiations, so all of this is kind of with that in the background, in good and bad ways. We got 45% wage increases for part-time lecturers over the course of the contract, and first ever in New Jersey history, job security. By the end of the contract, about half of adjuncts will have guaranteed year-long appointments, and about 15% will have 2-year appointments. For grads, we got 33% wage increases over the life of the contract, 5-year funding package guarantees. We have a framework for the recognition of fellows who constitute 1/3 of graduate workers at the university. We have teaching tenure in all but name for non-tenure track faculty, which will be automatic and require no review process. Unlike tenure, we have a central funding guarantee that absolutely applies to all grant-funded wage increases, and through grievance we believe will apply much more broadly. And through our bargaining for the common good work, we secured a $600,000 renewable annual fund for a community-governed nonprofit organization for primarily undocumented worker and undergraduate student housing needs. Among many other things, those are some of the highlights of what we were able to win in a 5-day strike that I think worked. So thank you so much, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Ian. All right. So I think I'm next. So I will introduce myself, right? So I thought I'd use my time today to talk a little bit about the particularity of tenured and tenure-track faculty. Of course, there are many things we have in common with other academic workers on our campuses, and identifying these is a crucial part of any wall-to-wall strategy. We're all concerned about a lack of affordable housing in our communities. We're all experiencing a speed up in our work due to severe understaffing and the ongoing impacts of COVID-19 on our students and ourselves. We all need and would benefit from robust reinvestment in public higher education. And while tenure stream faculty have relative privilege in the current university academic labor system, this system is also not generally working for us either. As Aaron Bartram so eloquently put it in a talk at the 2023 AHA, the burnout that secure scholars are feeling is phantom pain where our colleagues should be. Our work conditions, even when different, are inextricably linked. When one set of workers in a department is unable to afford to live where they work, when they're overworked and overwhelmed, when they're facing layoffs and reductions, when we can't recruit and retain people because the conditions have become so degraded, this impacts us all. But I also don't think we do ourselves any favors by ignoring the structural differences and complex power dynamics between our units. So I thought it would be useful to focus some on the specific position of tenure stream faculty in my reflections today. So as a point of clarification and terminology, I'll probably generally use Senate faculty as my shorthand for tenured and tenure track faculty, since that's the term we use here in the UC context, but just to explain that for folks going forward. My own assessment is tenure stream Senate faculty can play a critical role in university labor struggles, either by acting in solidarity with other academic workers or, unfortunately, by undermining and weakening those struggles. Some Senate faculty may still imagine that there's a neutral position to take, but this has always been a fiction, and it's even more so in the context of today's upsurge. But I also think we can't get to where we need to go or make the really big changes that we need to make in higher education without getting more Senate faculty organized and activated as workers, and not just as participants in fairly constrained shared governance processes. I want to be clear, this is not to say that we are more important than other campus workers, or that other workers can't make transformative changes without us. But I do think that we will all get much closer to the universities we want if Senate faculty are part of the wall-to-wall fight. And I say this based on an analysis of the power structure of universities. If we don't organize tenure stream faculty as part of a broader academic worker struggle, then Senate faculty can and will be a very significant roadblock. Specifically, if Senate faculty are not situating themselves as part of a community of academic workers, then they can be mobilized as very effective agents of repression by campus administrations who regularly call on us to break other workers' strikes for the good of our students, whether that be graduate workers or undergraduates. I'm going to make this concrete. During the Wildcat here, I watched as colleagues who see themselves as progressive, colleagues who loudly proclaim themselves as being supportive of graduate students and their economic needs, called students into individual and group meetings, told them they were worried about them, concerned that their participation in the strike was only harming their own academic progress, that they couldn't win what they sought to achieve, that it was time to submit grades and get back to work. By deploying personalized and emotional articulations of their care for graduate students in the context of these often trusting, but also very hierarchical supervisory relationships, these concerned faculty were by far the most effective strikebreakers on campus. Or, as we saw during the Wildcat and the multi-unit system-wide strike, and as we're seeing now at Michigan, our university administrations regularly call on faculty to pick up the struck instructional labor of graduate workers, teach their sections, do the grading, or just make up what the Michigan grads are calling bullshit grades, all supposedly for the sake of our undergraduate students. Administrations call on our sense of professional responsibility as educators, invoke our commitments to our students, and then ask us to act in ways that ultimately undermine the integrity of education in the current moment and stymie the longer-term project of improving the university and our students' learning conditions writ large. Of course, these messages are also used to pressure striking K-12 teachers. These are not unfamiliar messages, right? We should be used to these. We should expect them. They're also used against the striking workers on our own campuses. But they're a seductive message because they provide people who are either nervous or uncomfortable with withholding their labor, as well as those who are actively opposed to doing so, with a moral argument for why they will cross a picket line, pick up struck work, or simply give everyone an A. And without our own internal organization, if faculty are left to make decisions about how to navigate these situations in isolation from one another, or if the only conversations taking place are in the context of often politically divided departments, it can be hard for faculty to resist these pressures. But our experience in SCFA is also that tenure stream faculty can be organized and can be effectively mobilized to act in solidarity with other workers. And importantly, when we do, our solidarity can have material benefits. Hundreds of UC faculty signed a solidarity statement with UC AFT, committing to honor their picket line and not teach classes in the weeks before their announced strike in fall of 2021. Similarly, hundreds of faculty pledged to indefinitely withhold their labor during the UAW multi-unit strike. Adding our missing labor to these fights helps to extend and deepen their impact. Seeing visible Senate faculty support and solidarity can also strengthen the resolve of other units. I remember one meeting during the Wildcat in particular where grads were exhausted, disheartened, low on energy, and a couple of faculty speakers came forward to say that they were still there, still with them, still supportive. There was a notable shift. And again, this is not to say that faculty are necessary or essential for people to feel supported, but we can be one part of that sustenance. Senate faculty, in solidarity with other workers, can use institutional mechanisms like departments, academic Senate bodies, and professional organizations to make public statements, shape the narrative around worker struggles, and build wider support. Senate faculty can also use our specific roles on different university committees to call for accountability from the campus administration. A good example here was when the UCSC Senate Committee on Academic Freedom brought forward a resolution condemning the use of an online reporting system where students could report any changes to their classes during the Wildcat, what we called the Tattlebot. With support from this committee and several former chairs of that committee, the resolution passed the Senate easily. The administration removed the reporting form. And then finally, Senate faculty can use our actual plenary authority over certain academic policies, especially related to grading, to make decisions that could either undermine or support a strike action. So all of this suggests to me that there's strategic value in building organizations of Senate faculty who see themselves as workers, who understand their shared interests with other university workers, and who situate themselves on the side of labor rather than positioning themselves either as management or as intermediaries between the administration and other workers. Faculty have many concerns about our universities, about the increased contingency of academic labor, decreasing number of tenure-track positions, pressures toward online education, growing class sizes, lack of time and support for research, underpay of staff and the resultant staff vacancies, turnover and loss of crucial institutional knowledge, expanding administrative and bureaucratic tasks, precarious living conditions of our students, their associated barriers to their learning, and those are just a few. And we care about all of these things, not just because we're self-interested and concerned about our own work conditions, although that is certainly part of it, but because we tend to be pretty deeply invested in the universities where we work. Many of us see ourselves as being here for the long haul. We desperately want these to be places of transformative education and meaningful research. We believe in the mission. So this is fertile ground for Senate faculty organizing as part of a wall-to-wall strategy. Many of us really do care about the university as a whole and about the quality of higher education. The challenge, though, is turning these long-standing complaints, again, of which we have many, into collective action. And this is one of the key benefits and key tasks for Senate faculty unions. They provide an ongoing structure for channeling faculty discontent. Senate faculty unfortunately are often demobilized, whether it be to our exhaustion and overwork, our cynicism about the possibility of change, our perpetual hope that maybe this time we'll be able to address the concerns through the mechanisms of shared governance. As a profession, we're generally committed to the idea of persuasion as a method for creating change. It's a key part of what we do in our work. So it's not surprising that faculty revert to the idea that if we just write another strongly worded letter, it will convince the administration that this is the right thing to do. So it can take a while for faculty to come around to the realization that persuasion isn't working, and that having great evidence and compelling arguments isn't necessarily enough. And so it's certainly the case that many faculty, especially more senior faculty, have a tendency to identify themselves as professionals who are pursuing an intellectual calling, or perhaps to understand themselves as the university rather than as workers in the university. But I think some of these things are changing. Our work conditions become more degraded as the university administration becomes increasingly distant from the on-the-ground work of the faculty, as we confront the increasingly corporatized and neoliberalized version of education, as we see that our previous approaches to trying to fight austerity budgets aren't working. They haven't yielded the desired results. So these dynamics and the upsurge of labor organizing among graduate and contingent academic workers have all generated conditions for a more robust and vibrant Senate faculty discussion of unionization, labor activism, and political strategy. And so here at UCSC, we've been really grateful to and inspired by the other academic workers on our campus. Their struggles have energized a new wave of faculty activism here. Faculty who didn't know each other met out on the picket lines during both grad worker strikes. We quickly figured out who our fellow activists and organizers were, who we could count on to do the work of making banners, printing t-shirts, setting up a picket schedule. We identified who liked to write op-eds, who wanted to speak at rallies, and who would bring the musical instruments for the daily marches down the main road to the base of campus. We met a lot, we got organized, and I think that experience has really enlivened our union. Over the past several years, we've seen graduate workers also begin to ask more of Senate faculty, and I'd like to think that that's at least partly because here at UCSC, we've shown that some of us will actually step up and stand with them, including withholding our own labor. While the system-wide UAW leadership was quite vague in their communications with Senate faculty, saying in one Kukva town hall, for example, they didn't want to give faculty any particular direction for what our solidarity might look like, SCFA, on the other hand, met with UCSC grad leaders who were quite clear. The best way to support their strike would be to honor the line and withhold their own labor in solidarity. They understood not everyone would be able to do this, or that they might only be able to do so for a limited period of time, but they also clearly articulated that this would be the most effective way to contribute to the struggle and therefore bring the strike to a positive conclusion. And importantly, that conversation didn't come out of the blue. It felt like the logical next step in the relationships we'd already been building across the two units. But while we in SCFA have been absolutely transformed by our experiences during these graduate workers' strikes over the past few years, we've learned a lot from these comrades. I don't want to suggest or imply that graduate students should go out and try to organize faculty. UCSC Senate faculty organizers have been activated and inspired by graduate workers, but organizing Senate faculty is our responsibility. We should not expect graduate students, lecturers, or staff to organize us, especially given the often hierarchical institutional relationships we have to these other units. we need to organize ourselves. So moving forward, what that means to me is that faculty unionists need to be having ongoing conversations with our colleagues about the issues we're facing as a university, the problems and challenges we encounter as teachers and researchers, and then connecting those to the conditions of other workers on our campus. And what is, I think, probably more difficult, we need to engage more of our colleagues in an ongoing analysis of how we think we can actually transform our institutions into the kinds of educational workplaces we want. We can certainly benefit from working alongside the systems of shared governance. We want people to write the letters and op-eds, but we need to be cognizant of the limits of those approaches. We need to be thinking strategically and carefully with each other about other forms of power, including the potential power we have through collective bargaining, labor action, and oppositional politics. And in my view, this includes thinking about the value of wall-to-wall organizing and campaigns. If we can work with other academic workers to develop some shared understanding of the kinds of changes we want, something that actually doesn't feel too distant to me, that feels quite proximate and real, then organizing our coworkers across status and unit has enormous potential for actually transforming our universities. But the hierarchies and divisions in the academy are strong, and it will take real work to build a collective of tenure stream faculty who are ready to make common cause with other workers and to take up more militant and oppositional relationships to their employers. It's a long process, but it's one that I think tenure stream faculty can come to see that we need to embark on, because we're not going to get the university that we want without at least trying. Now we got Jeremy.
Hi, everybody. Try to overcome my impulse to not lean into a mic by doing so. The first sentence of my prepared remarks is the question of wall-to-wall organizing, like of organizing in general, is usually best pursued by closely examining the situation on the ground in a concrete organizing scenario, right? Things like what the existing units are, their relative levels of organization and militancy, their means of wielding disruption, the possibility of coordinating worker demands. These are the questions that are really important. And so I want to stop there to just say thank you so much to everyone who's contributed today. This has been a real wealth of such on-the-ground thinking. And if I don't contribute in quite that way, if I sort of try to step back a little bit and think through the implications of some of what's being said, I think what's really exciting about this event and what I've been hearing and what people are thinking and talking about on their breaks and the rest is that there's, in this labor upsurge of higher ed, there's a sense that there's an inadequacy in this sort of existing organizing common sense, and that people are really trying to pick up strands from each other and figure out like what might form an adequate new common sense for this moment. That's what's really exciting about this conference. So thank you everyone for being involved in putting it together. I'd like to contribute, if I can, by trying to think through what some of those implications are and raise some more just like basic theoretical questions about worker organizing that hopefully just denaturalize some of the existing common sense and interrogate it and think about where we might go from here, particularly with the question of wall-to-wall organizing and organizing workers as such. So there's an obvious kind of I'll call it arithmetical truth. We've also thought about like additive power or aggregate power, this kind of sense that more workers banding together is more power, right? And that's true at some level. I'm not going to try to discourage us from thinking about that, but the assumption is that the individual worker is a kind of unit of power that just gets added up and aggregated into, with addition of sort of homologous units. And I think there's a kind of moral corollary that often gets expressed as an individual imperative to solidarity with other workers through collective action, regardless of their sector or status, right? Which is, again, not something I'm going to argue with. If you're committed to a program of empowering workers through collective action, you're likely to support the demands of all workers for self-determination, and that's a good thing. But as commonplaces, both of these things, which I think exhibit something like a subjective and objective like theory of what worker power is, they're compelling precisely because they reduce other differences to an underlying structural relationship, that between workers and their boss. And I think this is the political basis for any labor solidarity. So that's a good thing. At the same time, it's very abstract and it's not a very useful guide, I think, to concrete organizing practices. And worse, it sometimes tends to produce outcomes that are in tension with its own premises. Forms of solidarity that are individualized and moralistic rather than collective and political. And I think this is largely because the differences, and in particular the institutional organization of those differences, form the landscape within which the exercise of worker power unfolds. Now, this topography is obviously currently defined by sectoral union representation in discrete bargaining units, with the result that the way these commonplaces are deployed, that is kind of arithmetical increase of power and expression of solidarity, tend to be corralled into forms of mutual support and assistance between worker categories. The fact that everyone is equally a worker, which is the assumption of both commonplaces, is a formal reduction. It's not a central premise. Bargaining units obviously have demonstrable advantages. I'm not going to try to undo those. I want to think through their limitations, however, as ways of conceiving of ourselves as workers. Paramount among, I think, these limitations is the fact that a unit is defined according to functional relationships to the institution. And that's terrain that's been established by the boss. Anyone, I think, who's followed the formation of a new unit with these sort of back and forth quibbles about who exactly belongs in it will recognize this. Typically, the union wants more workers included in accordance with a more expansive definition of that category, but they must argue this on the same basis as the boss does in seeking to restrict it, which is to say, by determining whether or not certain job descriptions truly belong in the same category. So from the standpoint of that institution's labor relations, this has an obvious and straightforward value of streamlining a bargaining process, right? By codifying the relationship to unions as part of its business model and hashing out the details of a certain designated type of contract independent of other types. But it does have more subtle advantages for the boss as well, precisely in the way I think that it sanctions these distinctions at all. So when bargaining with, say, maintenance workers, they may on the one hand acknowledge the specificity of this type of work, perhaps through agreeing to bargain certain workplace safety provisions, but on the other hand, they also ensure that the horizons of what these workers may achieve is set by the type and conditions of the work they do. Whatever they may win or lose does not directly translate into a different horizon of expectation for dining hall workers, for administrative staff, for teachers, and may in fact be seen as negatively impinging on those other workers' interests. Just anecdotally, the recent grad wins are coming across in my unit, UCAFT, precisely as budgetary layoffs that are emerging right now. And that the union is fighting to stave off. This keeps membership focused on winning gains that are specific to their particular sector of work, and especially historically on the incremental increase of a compensation package that has already been determined in relation to the type of work or established through the precedents of previous bargaining campaigns. I think there's a profound difference between arguing that your compensation falls short of industry standards and arguing that workers should be paid enough to work and flourish where they live. One is a narrowly economic demand, the other is a political demand. It's a demand that brings people together as a question of shared values. I'm really reminded of Lucy's comment on that closed the first panel. I'm not going to risk everything for 3%. I'll risk things when I think that the things we value are at stake. Things like childcare as a social value, not a sectoral interest. Things like the international student concerns that were part of the recent UAW campaign and things like this. From the standpoint of the union, on the other hand, the same typologizing logic has a de facto plausibility that's leveraged on similar grounds. Recruiting and mobilizing members is pursued under the assumption that workers unite principally on the basis of their shared job characteristics as defined by the institution. My own bargaining unit, which represents non-tenure track instructors at the University of California, I think is a poignant example of this. In a certain way, the posture of the union cannot be otherwise than defensive, even when it most seeks to be a vanguard. When we bargained a new contract several years ago, the campaign was correctly framed as seeking to set a new standard across the academy for contingent teaching employment, but the content and achievements of that campaign were always limited to making a certain type of employment less contingent rather than more secure, since the basis of the unit's existence is widespread contingent employment. It doesn't directly challenge the existence and growth of such a unit within the institution, which is responsible for the conditions that were and are facing our membership. I think when this kind of functional affinity grouping is framed as the logical basic unit of all worker organizing, solidarity is principally elicited and conceived as aggregative. That is, we all make demands together as a form of leverage that better secures us various gains and protections as individuals and for our interests. We pooled our demands. It's now a bit more difficult to fire me. I pocket some more money. I have some other protections, and these are really important in concrete gains, right? But the terrain hasn't been shifted, not fundamentally. This kind of aggregative but individualized action, which of course is the foundation of most conceptions of electoral politics and often imported by there into labor politics, only makes sense insofar as there's some formal or functional congruence between my own situation and that of the others who make up the unit. This has important implications for a worker's relationship to other units as well. That is what inter-unit solidarity looks like. We often show up to the rallies and pickets of other unions, right? We unfurl our banners, we chant "same struggle, same fight," or say like, "we're here in solidarity with you." But for the most part, we do this only insofar as we agree with and endorse their cause. That is, we're expressing a moral solidarity with these workers. And I think it's no surprise that people who do show up in this way tend to be those who conceive of themselves as committed to labor or labor activists above and beyond their particular membership in a union, independent of their material interests as workers. It's an ideological, not a material commitment. The point I'm trying to make is that other unions and workers are seen as engaging in a parallel struggle rather than truly the same struggle, one that I might agree with rather than having a stake in. The contractual clauses which routinely bar units from striking in sympathy with each other are, I think, only an expression of this, and the phrase sympathy strike, I think, actually just distills this dynamic. Even as most unions would prefer the right to strike with their fellow unions, they typically accept discrete bargaining units with concerns specific to their membership as the natural basis for advancing workers' struggle as a whole, and they hope to lend weight to other struggles in exchange for the reverse. It's a moralizing injunction that we often hear, to show up for them, they showed up for us, right? But it's at the same time a simple quid pro quo. Especially when you just compare it to showing up for each other, right? And to be clear, I'm not saying we should scrap our existing and hard-won structures of worker power, but I want to probe what we implicitly accept when we operate on this terrain, and so that we can contest the terms and not just the content of worker struggle. I find it instructive to actually reflect on how counterintuitive it actually is to think that my most immediate affinities as a worker are with other contingent faculty who have the same functional relationship to the university as I do. Most of the profound difficulty of organizing in the adjunctified stratum of the university stems from the near total lack of pre-existing networks that connect membership outside of the union. So the nature of our employment is already extremely fragmenting. Most of us know that, and we've heard some about it today. The task of organizing in this terrain is to forge connections precisely where they're not otherwise fostered in the everyday environment of the job. Just finding out who is out there is a significant portion of the work, as anyone who's spent time in the Excel spreadsheets knows, right? It's quite unlike industrial shop floor organizing, like in this sense. It's closer to organizing in gig work, domestic work, things like this. But unlike a lot of otherwise similar scenarios, our job does embed us in a complex network of everyday relationships to other workers across and frequently outside of union representation. I have far more immediate and organic connections to the groundskeepers, student advisors, maintenance workers, administrative staff, and others who work in my college than I do to other contingent faculty. The same is true for others who work within specific departments or programs where everyday activities are performed in close connection with workers from across represented units and often with unrepresented workers as well. So confronted with such existing connections, we might be tempted to think we have no way to pursue a common set of goals, given differences in how our appointments are made, the structure of our retirement funding, our eligibility for health care, things like this, which we otherwise kind of constrain our self-conception with. But in my experience, there are very deep affinities between our situations, and these touch on more directly political questions than the more narrowly construed wages, benefits, protections kind of schema. Whatever the particular struggles we have, they're generally the outcome of being at the lower end of an institution that principally operates through hierarchically administered austerity imperatives. In the workplace, and experiences I observe among other colleagues all the time, there's a widespread sense of fragmentation and lack of basic control over the conditions and fruits of our work. The nature of this work varies, precisely as it does in any specialized and interdependent workplace. But this shouldn't be seen as a barrier to solidaristic action, because working together interdependently is precisely what we already do. The barriers are much more likely to be the legal and institutional structures that sift and sort out our role, narrowing our own self-conception to our bureaucratic functionality. Let me use this to pivot from the more theoretical questions, the always essential problem of simple power, which many people have already talked about today. Okay, what we've seen in terms of the uneven distribution of disruptive power that so many have talked about today, right, is that withholding teaching or research, for example, in the immediate term is a PR scandal, not a business disruption. And the UC has really incorporated PR scandals very well into its basic business model, okay? What the real disruptions actually come from the way that these intersect with other functions of the university and the functions that other workers occupy. That disruptive capacity is always magnified by its interaction with other roles. Two lessons seem to come out of this for me. The first is that basing an organizational strategy on shaming the institution, that is a moral critique. However useful this may be in certain conjunctures, let's shame them, that's fine, right? It's never a replacement for focused and sustained business disruption. It's perhaps obvious, but I think it's important because leadership in all the major UC unions at various points in the recent past and beyond have pursued this. Moral condemnation is one of the few tools that promises to overcome weaknesses in sectorally wielded worker power and that appears to involve the solidarity of other workers while at the same time strictly honoring the limitations placed on solidaristic action. These are sobering conclusions, but we have seen at the same time many acts of material solidarity emerge within recent strikes. I'll sum up by just saying that I think organizing wall-to-wall is essential for pulling union activism out of its member services tendencies and redefining why and how workers wield their power in the workplace. Especially in very large, complex, and diffuse institutions like the university, it is also much more effective in deploying that power in a way that's genuinely collective and that as such threatens the boss's capacity to manage and contain its effects. Insofar as unions in their tamer mode, their routine mode, are already accepted as an internal cost of doing business, that's precisely the point. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Janina.
So the University of California has 36 bargaining units represented by 17 different unions across 10 campuses. I've spent most of my life working at like small bookstores and coffee shops where unionizing wasn't really a possibility. And when I was looking at the university as a place that I wanted to spend the rest of my working career, one of the benefits that I saw was the possibility of, or what I assumed was the inevitability of being represented by a union. It hadn't occurred to me that there were still positions on campus that weren't represented, and I somehow found myself in one of those units. So one of the first things I did when I got hired in 2017, which is right on the edges of the Janus versus AFSCME decision, was to march myself down to the picket line where AFSCME and UPD were on strike and sign myself up to be a voluntary member of UPD. I had no way of knowing at the time that I was joining a long history of both minority unionism at the campus, at the UC, but also a critical part of the formation of my own union. Sorry, I'm very anxious. For all of the speaking I do in front of people in my job, most of it's not about stuff like this. So a minority union is sometimes called a members-only union. It's basically what my place in my union is. It's a union or a group of workers organizing together without a contract, without recognition, and without bargaining rights. Some good examples of that right now are Amazonians United and the Alphabet Workers. It's also sometimes used to talk about unions that have majority of representation of an entire unit, but are in right-to-work states. So in 1979, the Berman Act, or the Higher Education Employer-Employee Relations Act, was passed, which gave workers in California in higher education the right to collectively bargain. And this was not to say that there weren't unions in higher education before. There were, and critically, there were two at UC Berkeley, both AFSCME, one representing exclusively custodians, and the other a wall-to-wall union of representing everyone except academic workers. So when the Berman Act passed, it was, the UC was ready. They were ready to organize, they were ready to form units. I'm gonna sort of yada over what that looked like. But needless to say, AFT at that moment won librarians, CNA won nurses, there were campus-specific units, firefighters, and in AFSCME won clerical workers, service workers, patient care, technical units, but they lost researchers by a small margin. There was a large group of workers that are now often referred to as the 99s, which meant missing data or policy-covered staff. A subset of those are administrative professionals, a subset of those are student services professionals. They're kind of arbitrary designations that qualitatively describe what people imagine as similar work. But many of the administrative professionals and SSPs were largely a group of women in career track administrative positions. So at the time, the two units that AFSCME had going into HERA were minority unions. They were representing workers, but they had no contract. So when those units were formed, the majority of workers that weren't captured in those units remained with AFSCME as voluntary members in a minority union. So in 1984, after those units had all kind of settled, Gerald McKinty, who was the president of AFSCME at the time, instructed International to come in and break up the union to sort of fracture it into campus units. It had the function of basically removing the efficacy from the workers and turning it all over to staff. It was a intentional move to gain control of the unions by staff. In that moment, they realized that the majority of the workers that were running the union were unrepresented minority union workers, and they sort of disenfranchised them, told them that they would not support any of their grievances, and point blank that they weren't interested in bringing in new units into AFSCME. So a group of those workers who were key stewards, key board members, organized amongst themselves to leave the union and form UPD, which is the University Professional and Technical Employees. And UPD started as a minority union with 90 members at UC Berkeley, expanding rapidly to UCLA and UC Santa Cruz. They were able to do that without organizing across all 10 campuses, specifically because they didn't have a contract and they weren't recognized. So this foundation in minority unionism also made UPD a home for voluntary members system-wide who continue to this day to serve as stewards and on local system-wide boards. During their first 3 years, there were no elections, no contracts, but they filed disputes over working conditions, including a lawsuit over, to dispute overtime exemption classifications, and were actually able to remove classifications from that exemption law. They also fought on behalf of a UCLA employee who was consistently hired for 12 months a year, laid off for 1 day, and then rehired in order to stop him from being in a career staff position. And more recently, UPD actually led the fight to get family and bonding leave for staff, which included policy-covered staff. We now have 8 weeks of paid leave, which is exclusively due to the fight that UPD waged. And it's uncommon for that to be so clearly a part of a union campaign, is to fight for something for unrepresented workers. So eventually in 1993, UPD affiliated with CWA, but in the formation of that, they took a lot of steps to make sure that they were positioning themselves as a democratic union. They were devastated by what happened in AFSCME, and they basically did everything that they could to be the opposite of that. So where a good example of this is where AFSCME kept 90% of the dues and left only 10% with the campus locals, UPD decided to keep 90% of the dues with the campus locals and only 10% for the statewide. And while that may have eventually proved impractical, it showed their commitment to keeping control of the financial resources locally. They were careful about the structure of the union. They set up a constitution that made it a fireable offense for union staff to participate in or interfere with bargaining and grievances. They believed that members needed to do much of the work of running a union as possible, including the critical and strategic decision-making, and that union staff were a necessary evil to maintain the day-to-day functions. I'm looking at Jeb. Doesn't mean they're not our comrades, but they understood that there was a structural difference between the priorities of a staff member and the priorities of rank and file. This is very much what I would think of as the labor notes tendency. It's a tendency in fundamental opposition to business unionism, where it keeps the primary control of the union with the members. But for this model to work, it requires a huge focus on education, mentorship, and member engagement. And I'm gonna have to yada yada over some more stuff. But essentially in my union, that the structure of the union itself didn't inoculate them against one of the lowest points in the labor movement, and it didn't prepare them for Janus. And despite so much attention to the union and the union structure, when Janus happened, organizers that had sort of come up under the guidance and mentorship of the founding members of the union organized a takeover of our union in order to prepare for Janus. And it was very much, when I spoke to one of these lead members, it was very much, it was very much inspired by Jane McAlevey. And in the moment, you know, the No Shortcuts was just starting to make the rounds, and it offered a structural way to do organizing that felt really important. So it's that moment, the leadership takeover, where I joined UPD, and over time, I eventually ended up becoming one of the lead organizers for the SSP campaign to organize unrepresented workers as a test site at UCSC and at UC Berkeley. And one of the critical failures of that fight was kind of like an opposition between what I would call my tendency towards shop floor organizing and the staff and leadership's focus on creating a bargaining unit that could win a contract. And so huge portions of what happened were a fight between our desire for control over the campaign and the staff and leadership desire for control over the campaign, where we wanted to start in summer. We had staff in regular workplace meetings asking to organize. The union staff wanted us to wait until they had all the materials ready. They didn't want us to meet or talk with each other until we could share their materials with each other. And stuff like that continued. We wanted to run a website. They said they already had one that would take a month to train us to use it. We wanted to work on delivering demands for like an advisor equity increase, and we were told we should do assessments. Over time, we had a second leadership takeover, again inspired by Jane McAlevey, although this one with more of a focus on installing staff to run the union. And we were told that it was critical for us to gain the support of the new leadership. So when we met with them to get the list of new workers, even though I actually already had a copy of that list, it was presented to me as important to gain their trust and support. And part of what that means is we were always looking at this as believing that the power of the union was with the staff and the leadership and not with each other. And when I look back on that campaign and that failure, that's largely what it all comes down to. Over time, we had consistent delays, consistent pushbacks. All of our timelines were geared towards wanting to pay attention to the workflow of staff, and the union was constantly shifting those to the workflow of the union. And eventually, the lead organizers on that campaign got other jobs or got classed out of the specific unit. When I look back on the disagreements that we had, it's clear to me that we were all deeply committed to our belief that the purpose of a union is to be a space where workers collectively fight consistent and overwhelming exploitation from their employer. But it's common in unions, including mine, to fetishize the contract as a single most important way to do this. All of our disagreements can be linked back to their focus on contract fights and my focus on shop floor organizing. They pulled resources away from our campaign to work on accretions, which was a strategic decision to build membership into existing units with a contract. The design and scope of the Student Services Professionals unit was a strategic decision to build a large unit that could increase the negotiating power of UPD and contract fights. The focus on assessments over shop floor organizing was a strategic decision to get additional staff from CWA to run the campaign and win a contract. And I would argue that this disagreement between a focus on shop floor organizing and contract fights is what prevents us from organizing any wall-to-wall campaign. UCSC alone has 16 bargaining units, 14 system-wide, and 2 campus-specific units. We have a union coalition called University Labor Unions, but they have never been able to organize a collective demand, instead focusing on communicating their bargaining priorities and seeking support for upcoming contract fights and coordinating contract timelines. In the one meeting that I attended, the members literally didn't understand why I was there since I didn't have a contract. We will never have a wall-to-wall collective bargaining unit at the UC, but that should not be a barrier to organizing collectively. And I think we can look at the tactics and strategies of minority unions to help us imagine what's possible when we act collectively outside the confines of a contract and the labor law. For myself, my goal in the upcoming year is to work with my administrative professional colleagues to set up a system of unrepresented stewards and work together to address the issues of all of our staff colleagues, bargaining units or not, with or without the union membership. In a recent staff survey we conducted, it became clear that many of our colleagues are working with staff shortages, required to pick up extra work without extra pay, or bullied by faculty, or housing insecure, and cannot envision life at UCSC any longer. Staff recruitments are failing, and people are moving out of the area to the private sector. A key goal for me in setting up this network and starting to address staff concerns is to do the work of a union without the formal structure and see what comes of that. And one of the things I think might be a way to organize in wall-to-wall is to think about a collective slowdown. The pressures that all of us are feeling with our increased work, or diminished colleagues, and our decreased pay, a lot of it stems from multiple recessions producing multiple speed-ups. And I'm not usually compelled by memes, but something I saw recently said that we have to stop thinking about burnout as burnout and start talking about it as exploitation, because when we talk about burnout, it's a personal failing, and when we talk about exploitation, it's structural. And that's it.
Thank you all. Those are really great and generative reflections, I think. I think one of the things that comes up for me, I'm not going to say much, I'll just say one tiny thing, and then we're going to open it up for some conversation questions from you all, is I think that all of these presentations bring forward the idea of unionism as something that you do, right? Not a membership that you hold, right? There's a real emphasis on the practice here. It's not about the contract or the dues, but this work of organizing in community with other workers, whether you have the same job title or not. And I think one of the things that this helps us think about in terms of wall-to-wall organizing is how do we think about wall-to-wall organizing as both something that conglomerates unions in the way that we see at Rutgers, right, as collectives, and also something that happens with workers across the multiple kinds of relationships that we have, right? We are organized in other ways, as departments, as institutes, in colleges, and I think Janina and Jeremy both really sort of point to the other sort of embedded workplace relationships that cross bargaining unit in the university, and that helps us think about wall-to-wall in a way that sort of bridges us from the space of just all workers are workers to, but not leaves us trapped necessarily in the space of like only thinking in terms of a coalition of unions, right? That we want to think about both of those things, that the coalition of unions can do some things for us, as the Rutgers case helps us think about, but also how do we think about the other kinds of relations that are part of a wall-to-wall organizing model. And I think, yeah, these are really helpful comments to get us thinking in those directions. So I'm going to stop there. I know there hasn't been as much time for sort of open Q&A as folks might have wanted so far. So I would say also people should feel free to ask questions from some of the previous panel that I saw that the end, it seemed like it got cut off a bit. So if you've got questions for folks from the previous panel that are still here, feel free to ask those too. Or comments. Floor is open. Yeah, I think there's one here too.
Hi, I'm Josh Brahinsky. I'm part of the UC AFT. And my question, it's like but I was also part of a union of, that was lecturers and tenured faculty together when I was at San Jose State. And when I was there, we had some of the best job security for lecturers that you could find. But the lecturers always felt sort of left out of the bargaining, right? And so there's this interesting tension, right, in the wall-to-wall vision of the smaller groups of people trying to get their voices heard. And I think it's a similar question that comes up in all bargaining, like if you have a bargaining and one of the issues is about gender things or race things or things that are not the majority of the people in the particular unit that you're in, and those often get swallowed by wage, right, by wage bargaining. And I think we saw some of that in the UAW strike just in the fall, right, where some of the local issues got swallowed by the big issues because the people who were running it saw those as sort of primary. So I guess I'm just interested in how to think about that either in a campaign, like how do we make campaigns that work, that don't just go to the thing that is like the biggest common denominator, and how do we do that in a wall-to-wall kind of situation as well? I'm just curious if you guys have thoughts.
Can we take another question? Thanks so much for this really excellent panel and really excellent panels throughout the day. I have a couple of, I guess, thoughts and questions. One is this question of structural power and thinking about it in relationship to like research 1 universities, research 2 universities, research 3 universities, because I think it when I think about CUNY, which is largely more teaching focused, right? And thinking about the structural power, like we don't have the big labs that are really gonna like hit the university, right? If we kind of strike labs, there aren't as many big grants, right? There aren't, nothing at the scale of a UC anyway, right? What does it mean for an institution like ours to strike in a city that, where there's this no, Taylor law, but also where the other unions, the other municipal unions are not strong, right? So we go out on strike and we say we shut it down, like in the most ideal scenario, we shut it down. We're really good at it. We create all the solidarity, we shut it down. and then what? What does that mean, right, to shut? So you cancel undergraduate teaching and you don't do the grading, and maybe you shut down a few labs. Like, what does that mean for New York City? I'm not sure. It's a real question that I grapple with in the absence of kind of more solidarity with the other unions in the city. Yeah, I had something else, but I've lost it, so.
Do you want to do one more? Anyone else? Yeah.
I have a really short question about wall-to-wall organising, because I think for us in Britain, when we hear the idea of wall-to-wall organising, I mean, we already have a union that covers the equivalent of grad students up to professors, as well as some higher paid administrators are all in the same union. And so for me, when I hear wall-to-wall organising, I think about including cleaners, security guards, ground staff, the kind of wall to wall, I guess is how I would imagine it. And I kind of wonder, is that just about where the current union structure is, that most of the discussion is about academic workers and academic staff? And have these debates come up in the American labour movement in this way around universities, or is it mostly that you're trying to overcome having academic workers in the same union? So yeah, thank you.
Is there anybody who wants to tackle? Maybe we can, Ian, if you want to start, since you actually have the most, and maybe with like Josh's question.
So just if I remember Josh's question correctly, I jotted notes down, but how do you concretely get priority for those issues? Is that like a way to think about your question? Or
For priority for issues that are not the bread and butter for everybody.
right, right. The easiest way for me to answer any of these questions is to reflect on what we have done, which is not to say it's the right way to do it, just to think through how we've tried to answer that question. So one of the ways we've tried to handle that is to figure out how do we identify those issues as concretely an issue for other categories of workers. So for example, one of what our full-time faculty members who were reporting back from organizing conversations found most useful in talking to tenure stream faculty was about the consequences of the job market crisis for their graduate students, and for their departments and for the future of their fields and labs and so on and so forth, and the future of their ability to do their work. Those trying to get the tenure stream faculty to concretely identify with grad demands, because we're in the same unit, because we bargain the same contract. And so even though there's not an obvious correspondence, there's not necessarily a correspondence between those two sets of demands, we were able to build some unity, I think quite a bit of unity there, which is complicated by the issue of PIs and by the labs, which I can also talk about if people are interested in that. But I think broadly speaking, that's what I would say. I don't remember the name of the third question asker, but I think that's an extremely important question for us to think through. I do, on behalf of my local, I do a lot of work with kind of trying to coordinate across unions and talk to other unions and build alignment, and so a lot of work through Higher Ed Labor United and other spaces. And one of the questions we get asked most frequently when we go to talk to non-instructional, non-research higher ed worker, unions that represent higher ed workers, is this seems like it's all about contingent workers. Like this seems like it's all about adjuncts. Which on some level it is, because that adjuncts are living the fun, their crisis is the core on some level of the general crisis. But and I don't think that we've figured out in how do we talk about it sense, and I also don't think that where we're working on the ground we've figured it out either, because if you're looking at a high density place like Rutgers, where more than 2/3 of the workers are organized, and yet you have the lowest waged workers, the grounds workers, the dining hall workers, which are also the unions with the highest concentration of racially minoritized workers. I don't think the gender breakdown is quite as distinct given the kind of larger structure of the university. And those unions are very, very different from, like, in the way that they operate democratically, in the way that they engage, in the way that members do or don't have control. We have experimented with department level meetings that try to incorporate as many people as possible, but every university is different, and oftentimes, in some institutional contexts, subcontractors do cleaning. For example, my department building is not cleaned by Rutgers employee, even though they have a Rutgers kind of insignia on their shirt, which doesn't mean that you can't organize with them. It just complicates the way that you would organize if you were to. I think these are significant questions, and maybe we can come out of the next 24 hours with an answer.
So for Josh's question, I think the thing that jumps out at me is that a lot of what I see fall away in the contract fights tend to be our working conditions, and we all share a lot of the same working conditions, and I think those are really like there's a lot of potential in those specific things for us to organize together outside of a contract. I'm thinking specifically about parents, and I think if working with grads and faculty and staff, I both have like faculty that I work with that are crippled when they have a child because of the lack of affordable childcare in Santa Cruz, and the same thing happens to grads, and the same things happen to staff. And there's no collective organizing around that outside of our bargaining units, and there should be. And I imagine that this is also true for workers in the service unions as well. And I think about the last question about like organizing across all sectors of the university. Something that really stands out to me is how much more I have in common in my personal like working relationship with graduate students and new faculty than I do with other staff who might hold an identical position to me that have lived in Santa Cruz for 30 years and bought a house in the 80s. So my relationship to being alive is very much bound up with the conditions that I have outside of my actual job. And I find, that the problems that I'm having of like exhaustion and overwork and all of that are also experienced by new faculty who are burdened by the rent crisis and by graduate students that are burdened by the rent crisis. And so I think if we can stop thinking of each other as like faculty and grads and service worker and start thinking of each other as workers, all of us workers with the same boss and similar living and working conditions, and where those overlaps happen and organize around that, there's a lot of powerful potential there.
Yeah, the one thing that I think I would add is there's some really interesting things happening, I think, in terms of the potential around, first I'd say, part of why the conversation around wall-to-wall starts, I think, here with academic workers is because we are not yet in the same unions and units, right? So we're sort of starting at a kind of different place, with the exception of Rutgers, where most of us are quite fragmented in these different ways that we've been talking about. But I also think there's some really exciting and really interesting things happening and sort of bubbling up right now around service workers in the UC, and AFSCME's recent sort of move around a $25 UC minimum wage that expands beyond the confines of their bargaining unit. And I think that's a sort of move in the direction of thinking in a wall-to-wall way that's not limited by the bargaining unit. And there's some really interesting relational work that I think happens between undergraduate students and AFSCME workers in particular, because they're often working together, right, alongside one another in the dining halls and in these different sort of conditions. So I think there's a lot of rich possibilities for expanding that conversation in those ways that are really important.
I'll just say something quickly to the last question, which kind of echoes some of what we heard actually on the last panel. It seems like I think we need to move beyond thinking this kind of like academic, non-academic divide. I think we do need to think together as workers, but it's not just in some principled thing or getting more workers or more power or something like that. It's actually also important for academic sector organizing, because as on the last panel they explored a little bit, academics tend to put their professional identity, their professionalized identity as academics above their status as workers, and that really can only happen with a very willful myopia towards your institutional structures that you occupy, and that's a real organizing like limitation. Yeah. So in that sense, it's important, I think, to do that. To Josh's question, I think like it's actually part of what I was trying to argue against is the idea that the wage should be the kind of universal leveler that we all get behind. I think that's a real problem. I mean, that's Marx 101, you know. that's the formal reduction I was trying to talk about, right? That we're all workers because we're wage workers. But at the same time, look what happened in this last round of UAW, right? There are a bunch of central demands: COLA, childcare, international students' fees, and things like this. And the argument was already even preemptively being made to roll that into the wage. Why? Because everyone gets a wage. So you can spend it on your international student fees, or you can spend it on having kids, or you can spend it on a yacht if you know, or like a really well compensated like grad worker. So these become like discretionary, like, you know, ways to spend your income, and they're seen that way because those are seen as sectoral interests rather than questions of value. Like, do we value people who put in the time and labor to raise children? Do we value international students' contributions? And these are things that people can have a stake in, even if they're not like occupying that kind of position. It shouldn't be seen as a minority interest. It should be seen as a collective interest that we're willing to fight for. And I think people actually do want to fight for that stuff more than they want to fight for wages. I mean, maybe they think, you know, that like the wage is the most important thing, but when you really look at what like motivates people and keeps them going for the long haul, it's that stuff.
Yep.
I was going to make one more comment, but I want to see if there are questions actually before I do. I didn't want to take up too much time. Okay, so I just wanted to reflect a little bit on how important I think Janina's discussion of work outside of collective bargaining was, and I think that certainly, I mean, unions do collective bargaining. It's you know, kind of fundamental. But I think that a lot of what we're seeing, even in successful cases like Rutgers and also in places that are having a harder time, is we're seeing the limits of collective bargaining as the kind of fundamental like framework for what we're doing. And the crisis of the university is also not unique to the university. It's a part of a broader social crisis and political crisis. And I think that there are things that can be won even under maximalist, you know, outcomes through collective bargaining that are very, very good. And also, there is a need, I would argue, for the movement, to the extent it exists, to think through what politicizing the struggle involves. And I don't mean politicizing in terms of electing Bernie Sanders, as wonderful as that would be. I mean, you know, taking the struggle through and beyond the collective bargaining process to another level. That's more theoretical. Like, that sounds more like abstract than I wanted it to, but that's what I wanted to add. Thanks.
I have one thing too. I didn't want to like end this without addressing your question, which none of us answered at all. During the end of the organizing campaign that I was working on for the SSPs, I realized that that the union had pretty much mostly presented me with barriers towards the organizing work that I wanted to do. And one of the things we started to do near the end of that was to imagine what this campaign would look like if we didn't have the resources, support, or backing of our union. And that really opened up possibilities for us because we realized that there was so much potential in what we knew how to do as just regular workers that we knew, like, we could set up a dues structure through like a voluntary subscription campaign. We could get our own Google email addresses, like, you know, drive teams, whatever, websites. We knew how to run websites, it was whatever. But I wonder if thinking about that might be a good way for you to move forward, because you have so many state barriers that if you could imagine, like, how would you do this if you weren't tied to the union specifically? Like, could you organize a subscription, like imagining that you're going to get rid of dues, you're going to lose dues if you go on strike. What can you do in advance to inoculate yourself from that so that you're taking that leverage away from them? And what would it take to get all of your members to voluntarily sign up to pay dues separately?
Anything else from the room? All right. Do we have a break? Yeah? That's the next. Yeah. Let's take a break.